The desert wind whispered through the mesquite trees, carrying with it the scent of dust, sage, and something far heavier, loneliness. She walked slowly along the narrow trail, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other clutching a worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. Every step felt like a question with no answer. Where would she sleep that night? Who could she trust in a land that seemed determined to remind her of how utterly alone she was? The sky above stretched endless and merciless, as if even heaven itself had turned its face away. Her story hadn't begun in the desert, but that was where life had brought her. Cast aside, carrying the weight of new life within her, she had no family waiting, no friend's hand to guide her, and no name to lean on. The nights were long, the dangers many wild animals, strangers on horseback, and the deeper fear of her child being born into a world where no one would speak for him, or for her. Yet she pressed on, because what else could she do? A mother does not stop walking, even when her heart trembles. It was on one of those long, restless evenings, when the setting sun painted the rocks in gold and crimson, that she first felt the shift in the air. She wasn't sure if it was instinct or fear that made her stop. The silence grew thick, the kind of silence that always came before something or someone appeared. She turned, and there he was, half shadow, half light, a figure that looked carved from the very mountains themselves. His dark hair caught the breeze, his eyes steady, unreadable, but not unkind. He wore the marks of an Apache warrior, strong, proud, carrying the weight of generations in his stance. For a heartbeat, she wanted to run. She had heard the whispers, the warnings passed around campfires about warriors who guarded their lands with steel and silence. But her legs wouldn't move, and his gaze did not carry the cruelty she feared. Instead, he studied her worn shoes, her trembling hand against her belly, the exhaustion etched into her face. Something softened in his expression, though he said nothing at first. The desert wind filled the space between them, a living thing that carried all the questions neither dared to ask. She lowered her eyes, ashamed, frightened, but also aware of how vulnerable she looked. Alone, carrying a child, with nowhere to go. She had expected judgment, maybe even anger for wandering onto land that wasn't hers. What she hadn't expected was what came next. The warrior stepped closer, his voice low but steady. He spoke. Words that seemed too heavy for the air, words she never thought anyone would offer her again. He spoke of his name, his people, and what it meant when an Apache gave such a gift. He offered it not as a threat, not as a demand, but as a shield. She stared at him, her lips parted, unable to answer. Her heart raced, not out of fear anymore, but out of something else, something dangerous and unknown. Could she trust him? Could she let herself believe that kindness still lived in the world, wrapped in the strength of a man whose life was so different from her own? The child stirred inside her as if waiting for her choice, and there, in the gathering dusk, with the shadows lengthening and the stars preparing to wake, she found herself at a crossroads. To accept his offer could mean safety, a chance for her unborn child to belong. But it could also mean stepping into a life she could not control, into the hands of a man whose heart was a mystery. She opened her mouth, ready to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The warrior's eyes did not leave hers. The wind rose again, carrying the echo of his promise, the weight of what had been placed before her. And in that moment, with the desert night closing in, her world hung on a single choice. The words he had offered hung between them like a shelter she could not quite step under. She stood with one hand at her belly and stared at the space just past his shoulder, as if the horizon might answer for her. The Apache warrior did not move closer. He simply waited, the same way the desert waited for rain, without begging, without apology. She noticed the little things first, because little things meant safety. His horse stood at ease. His hands were open. His gaze held steadiness, not hunger. Still, the offer of his name felt too large to hold. It meant more than protection. It meant being seen that the evening deepened. A thin line of bats stitched the sky. She thought of the town she had left behind, the one with crooked fences and a bell that rang at the mission when the hour turned. She had scrubbed floors there for a time, folded sheets, carried water, keeping her eyes down so no one could read the bruise her heart wore. People in that place had names for her, too. Stray, fool, a burden no one had carried to term before. She had learned to keep quiet, to sleep in corners, to vanish when the questions came. The day she slipped away, the mission bell had sounded noon, and a few coins clinked in her pocket like small lies. She had walked until the road gave up and thinned into deer paths and dry creek beds. Pregnant and alone did not begin to say it. He spoke again, voice careful. "A name is a doorway," he said. "It lets you pass and it lets my people see you. It is not a chain." He glanced at her hand on her belly and then at the long scar on his forearm, silver in the last light. "If you take it for the night, it means I speak for you until morning. If you keep it past sunrise, I answer for you when we meet others. That is all it means now." There was a humility in the way he explained his custom, as if he knew the border she stood on and did not want to push her across it. She found her voice in pieces. "Why me?" The question sounded smaller than she intended. He looked toward the ridgeline where the wind combed a stand of juniper. "Tracks," he said. "3 riders, 2 days behind. The prints are heavy. One horse drags a bit. They look careless, not like my people. They turn where you turned. They follow." The word "followed" slipped under her skin. She swallowed. The desert felt vast a moment ago. Now it felt crowded. She asked, "You saw all that?" He nodded once. "The land tells what feet ask of it." He gestured to the east. "There is water not far from here. A seep that stays in the rocks when the tank dries. You are tired. The child is near asleep." She did not remember telling him that the baby moved less when she was scared, but somehow he knew. She let herself be led across a stretch of gravel. That sang beneath their boots. He kept distance, always a few steps ahead or to the side, where she could see him. When they reached a pocket of shade, he knelt and lifted a flat stone. Coolness breathed from the earth. He cupped water in his palm and offered it without looking directly at her face, like a kindness meant to be easy to take. "Thank you," she whispered. She drank, slow, careful. When she lowered her hands, she caught him studying the frayed edge of her shawl. It had a simple stitched pattern, a line of small diamonds her mother had taught her to sew. She could not say which hurt more, the memory of those lessons or the contrast with the present, where needles felt like weapons against her own thoughts. She glanced toward him. "You said your name is a doorway. What is your name?" He was quiet for a breath. "If you take it, I will say it to you," he answered. "If you do not, I will keep it, as my elders taught. A name is not a spectacle." They made a small place to rest. He set a few ocotillo sticks and draped his blanket. Across them, leaving it half open so the desert air could pass through. He laid his bow and quiver within reach, but not in a way that warned. She sat, easing down to the sand, every movement reminding her that the baby shifted the map of her body. The wind threaded through creosote, and somewhere a night bird called. He cut a slice of dried meat and set it on a clean flat stone at the edge of her blanket. "Eat," he said softly. "You will walk better with food." She took it, thinking how strange that an Apache warrior's care felt more gentle than any mercy. She had found where the cross hung over the mission gate. When she could think past the salt on her tongue, she said, "The riders, did they look like lawmen?" Her voice snagged on lawmen like a shirt on a nail. He considered. "Their horses step wrong for men who wear badges," he said. "The prints say hurry and show, not patience. They might be from a ranch or a camp of drifters." She looked at her hands. I left no debt there, she said. It was true, but not the whole truth. The child's father had been a trader with a laugh that went wide in saloons and thin in daylight. He promised a name and a small ring and a house with blue shutters, which was foolish because shutters out here were dust-swept boards that never showed blue. He had left when the road called his true name. She had not chased him. Shame did that.
For her?
Circling her like a wolf and whispering all the reasons she had no right to hope. The warrior studied the stars appearing over the ridge as if reading a pattern. I was not on this path by accident, he said after a time. We have a camp for the warm months, a day's ride from here. A patrol noticed smoke in a place where we do not leave it, near the canyon with the twin pines. I went to look. The ash was fresh, not ours. When I lifted my eyes, I saw you on the trail, alone. He paused. If you come with me, I can bring you near, but not into camp right away. My people are careful. I will speak first to those who guide us. That is our way. She nodded, oddly relieved to hear that he did not promise what he could not give. Boundaries made trust possible. She noticed how he made a point to say our way and those who guide us. There were elders. There were rules. She could live inside rules if they were spoken plain. What do I say if we meet anyone? She asked. Say you are under my protection, he replied. Say I offered my name for safe passage and shelter until your child is born. If they ask more, I will answer. The word safe passage reached for the place inside her that still believed in rescue but was afraid to show it. She slept, though not deeply. Dreams kept tugging at her, the sound of hooves. A shadow standing at the end of a hallway with doors that would not open. A child's hand she could not quite hold. When she woke, the moon had moved and the warrior sat a few paces away, awake. He had not slept. He was watching the eastern dark where sky meets stones. She whispered, Do you ever rest? He smiled without showing teeth. When there is no one to watch, I rest. She wondered what it meant to live like that, carrying his people's safety the way she carried her unborn child. Just before dawn, the wind changed. He stood. Time, he said. They ate a bit more, packed quietly, and followed a narrow wash that braided through low hills. He used his horse to carry their small bundles, but he never offered her the saddle, perhaps sensing that being on the ground helped keep her nerves settled. The path tightened. Once he paused and touched two stones stacked in a certain way, then knocked the top one down. A sign, he said. Not ours. Someone marks where they have been. She felt the old fear lift its head. Do we turn back? He shook his head. If we turn, we walk alone on the open flats. Here, the rock can hide us. In the canyon ahead, we choose where to be seen. As morning rose, the world colored in rust rock, pale sage, sky like an endless bowl. They stopped at a ledge where she could catch her breath. He handed her a strip of leather. Tie your shawl here, he said, pointing across her chest. It will not flap and show you. Sound carries. She did as he asked and found, to her surprise, that the simple act of securing loose cloth steadied her thoughts too. He watched her knot the leather, then tightened it one more notch with care, fingers sure and quick. Your mother taught you to stitch, he said. She blinked. How did you? He smiled a little. The line of diamonds. It is patient work. They moved again. In the higher light she could see more of him. There were bead patterns on the edge of his belt that told a story she could not read. A small feather was tucked near his shoulder, more practical than decorative, as if kept there for a use she might witness later. A thin cord at his neck held a piece of polished stone. She did not ask when he got it or what it meant. He had offered enough without questions. By midday they reached the mouth of a narrow cut that led into the canyon. A hawk circled far above. drawing a slow circle that made the world feel both watched and protected. He raised his hand, palm out. She stopped without asking why. He crouched, touched the ground, then lifted his fingers and sniffed. "Horses passed this morning," he murmured. "Not many. 2, maybe 3. They did not expect anyone to notice." He glanced at the walls that rose on either side. Sometimes men think rock is a wall with no ears. He gestured for silence, then moved into the shadows almost soundless, as if the canyon recognized him. She followed, copying his steps as best she could. They threaded a path along the left side where the shade hid them. Twice he held up 2 fingers, and she knew it meant wait. Twice she did, hard-knocking, while dust swam in slants of light and a small lizard considered her from a warm stone. At a bend, he turned and whispered, "If we meet them, you must choose. To use my name out loud makes it true among my people. If you keep silence, we pass as strangers." The choice came back to her like a river that found its old bed. A sound rose then, faint but certain, the clink of metal against leather, the fussy blow of a horse telling its rider it disliked the heat. He looked at her, and the canyon pressed in with the pressure of something about to happen. He reached for nothing. Not his bow, not a blade. He only touched the cord at his neck, the polished stone resting against his chest as if to ask it for wisdom. The noise grew a little, then stilled, then grew again as if the riders turned, uncertain which fork to take. He leaned close enough that she could see the tiny flecks of mica on his cheek from the canyon ledge. "If you speak my name, you stand." "Under it," he breathed. "It means I tell my people, and I tell the land, that you belong to my protection. No one takes that lightly. Not me, not anyone." The weight of his words fell over her shoulders like a blanket she was not sure she earned. Before she could answer, a call echoed off the walls, a lone bird note, sharp and then gone. He froze. She felt him hold still the way a tree holds still, roots deep. He answered with a sound that meant something she could not translate. Silence followed. The air felt crowded with meanings. Then another call came, shorter, farther off. His eyes narrowed. "That is not my people's way," he murmured. "It says, 'all clear,' but in a tongue that tries too hard to be ours." He turned to her, and for the first time there was urgency in the set of his jaw. "They are playing at signals," he said. "If we walk out wrong, we walk into hands that are not kind." Distant hoofbeats brushed the canyon floor. The baby shifted, and a stitch of pain caught her breath. She lifted a hand to her belly. He saw it and said, "We can wait in the rocks, but not for long. The shade will move. You are tired." He hesitated, and she sensed that he rarely hesitated. "If you take my name now, I will speak with the weight it carries. If you do not, I will still stand between you and trouble, but the words I use will not open the same doors." She looked down the canyon where the light brightened like a promise she could not trust. She looked at the man beside her, at the steadiness in his body, at the way he had tended to her without boasting or pity. The riders were somewhere close, close enough that dust on his sleeve lifted and settled with their approach. Somewhere beyond the turn, a horse shook its head, impatient. The canyon waited. The wind stilled. Every story she had told herself about survival crowded into that tight space with her. The Apache warrior held her gaze. "Choose," he whispered, "not as an order but as a gift." Her mouth opened. The first sound of his name formed on her tongue, and familiar, heavy, full of something she could feel even before she understood it. She drew breath to say it fully, to step through that doorway he had offered. And then the riders' shadows broke along the sunlit bend, sliding long across the stone toward them. She heard one of the men laugh, low and certain, as if he had already decided how this day would end. The echoes carried their confidence right to her feet. She stood very still. the name hot and alive in her mouth, wondering if speaking it aloud would save them or mark them before the canyon decided whose story it would hold. The laughter that rolled through the canyon was not loud, but it carried far, curling off the stone walls as if the earth itself passed the sound along. She stiffened, pressing her back against the cool rock, her hand firm against her belly. The Apache warrior's eyes never left the bend ahead, where the shadows stretched like long fingers. His stillness was its own kind of shield. He did not flinch, did not speak, only shifted his weight so subtly that she almost missed it, a readiness coiled inside a calm shell. The riders appeared piece by piece, first a boot in the stirrup, then the flank of a dusty horse, then the lean frame of a man with a rifle laid across his saddle. Another followed, and behind him a third, carrying himself with the ease of someone who thought the world bent to his command. Their clothes marked them as drifters, not soldiers, not ranch hands loyal to any brand. Dust clung to their hats. Sweat streaked their shirts, and yet there was a smugness about the way they rode. She saw it in the slouch of their shoulders, in the sharp smiles that meant they enjoyed the chase more than the destination. Her throat tightened. These were not lawmen. They were not men bound by duty. They were the kind who found their own rules in empty land, rules that often left others broken. One of them leaned forward and let his gaze sweep the canyon floor as though expecting something or someone to appear. The warrior watched in silence, his body a taut line between her and them. He touched the stone at his neck, almost reverently, as though drawing from a strength older than himself. The child stirred again, restless, as if he too sensed the danger. She pressed her lips together, fighting the urge to whisper, to ask what they should do. But she remembered his words. Silence could save them where noise betrayed them. So she stayed still, her breath shallow, trusting his ears to measure the moment. The first rider spoke. "Tracks don't lie," he said, his voice echoing. "She's in here. Belly big as a barrel, won't get far. You saw the print same as me?" The second chuckled, a sound without warmth. "Maybe she's got help. Ain't many would wander alone this far. Maybe we'll find more than we came for." His tone carried hunger, not for food, but for something crueler. The third man didn't laugh. He only said, "We keep on. If she's hiding, the rocks will cough her up. They always do." Her blood went cold. She dared a glance at the warrior, but he gave no sign of panic. Instead, he tilted his head ever so slightly, signaling for her to wait. She obeyed, though every nerve in her body screamed to run. The riders moved deeper, their horses' hooves knocking echoes off the walls. For a moment she thought they might pass, that the canyon's angles would hide them. But then one of the horses tossed its head and snorted, catching some faint trace of scent. The rider tugged the reins and leaned low, eyes narrowing at the shadows. He muttered something she could not hear, but the way his shoulders squared told her he suspected more than empty stone. The warrior shifted then, the smallest movement, his hand brushing against his bow. He did not draw it, not yet. His calm was unnerving, but also steadying. She realized he was waiting, weighing whether this was the moment she should speak his name aloud, or whether silence was still their ally. Her mind pulled backward, back to nights in the mission when she lay awake listening to footsteps in the hall. Back to the day the father of her child had walked away with nothing but a careless grin. Back to every moment she had been cornered, voiceless. Now pressed against the canyon wall. She felt the same fear rise, but alongside it came something else, something she had not felt in years, the sense that she had a choice. The riders paused, their horses restless. One called out, voice sharp, "Girl, you might as well come out. You can't hide behind stone forever. Better for you if you come easy." His words dripped with false kindness, like honey masking the poison beneath. The second man spat on the ground. If she don't, we smoke her out. Fire makes stone talk quick. He pulled a scrap of cloth from his pocket and wound it around a stick, as if he meant to prove his threat. The warrior's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence was louder than any warning. She could feel the choice pressing in again. Heavier now. Speak his name and tie her fate to his, or keep silent and risk being dragged into the open by men who cared nothing for her or the life she carried. The canyon seemed to lean closer, listening, waiting for her to decide, but before she could, the sound of another signal carried through the rocks, a short, sharp cry that did not belong to bird or man. The riders froze, glancing at each other. The third frowned. That ain't us, the second sneered. Could be her protector. Could be someone thinks to play hero. The first adjusted his grip on the rifle. Don't matter. We'll see soon enough. The warrior shifted his stance, his body angling just slightly in front of hers. It was a gesture so simple, yet it spoke volumes. He was ready to stand between her and whatever came. She realized then that even without her speaking his name, he had already claimed her safety as his task. Yet the weight of his offer still lingered, waiting for her voice to seal it. The air thickened with tension. She could feel her heart beating in her ears, her palms damp against the fabric of her shawl. The rider's eyes swept the canyon, searching, calculating. The warrior's eyes stayed steady, rooted in something deeper than fear. And she, caught in the middle, felt her breath snag on the edge of a decision she could not yet make. The canyon held them all in its stone embrace, every echo stretched thin, every sound magnified. Somewhere ahead, another shadow shifted, neither friend nor foe revealed yet. And in that uncertain moment, as the riders tightened their reins and the warrior's hand hovered close to his bow, she realized the story was no longer just about survival. It was about trust, about names, about the fragile thread that bound one life to another in the unforgiving silence of the desert. The next step, she knew, would change everything. But whether it would lead her toward safety or deeper danger, she could not yet see. And the canyon, ancient and indifferent, gave no answers, only the hollow echo of hooves drawing closer, and the weight of a name waiting to be spoken. The canyon air grew heavier with every heartbeat. The riders had stopped just far enough away that their shapes stretched long against the stone, half hidden in the light. Their horses pawed the ground, restless, sending up small puffs of dust that floated like warning smoke. She pressed herself tighter against the wall, every muscle tense, her breath shallow. The warrior stood still before her, his shadow covering hers, his bow lowered but ready. He did not speak, and in that silence she could feel how close the kifil moment had come to breaking. The first rider leaned forward in his saddle, his voice carrying sharp and taunting. No use in hiding, girl. We know you're here. A woman alone with no name, no place to go. We'll give you one. His words clawed at her chest. The warrior's head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing. He didn't move, but the air around him seemed to harden, as if the canyon itself bent toward his will. The second rider laughed, the sound harsh and cruel. She's got a burden with her too. Makes her slow. Makes her ours. His gaze swept the shadows, and she felt it brush against her like fire. Her hand went instinctively to her belly, as if she could shield the child from words that cut deeper than blades. The warrior shifted then, only enough that his presence blocked her fully from view. The third rider, quieter than the others, lifted his rifle. He didn't laugh, didn't taunt. His silence was worse. He scanned the canyon, eyes sharp, patient, searching. When his gaze lingered too close, the warrior's hand slid across the curve of his bow, slow and deliberate. She saw the cords in his forearm tighten, the promise of violence balanced against his calm restraint. She wanted to speak, to whisper his name, to bind herself to his protection as he had offered. But the sound stuck in her throat, caught between fear and trust. The riders shifted in their saddles, muttering to each other. "If she don't show," the first said, "we smoke her out." The second reached again for the rag and tinder. At his belt, fire in the canyon would swallow everything air, stone, life. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might echo. The warrior leaned close, his words almost breath against her ear. "If they light fire, you run when I say. Do not look back." His calm carried no doubt, as though he had already weighed what he would risk for her. Her hands trembled, not only from fear but from the weight of a choice she had never been asked to make before. To trust someone fully, to step into the shelter of a name that was not her own. The riders moved closer. Hooves struck sharp against stone, ringing out like hammers. Dust rose, clouding the narrow space. She felt the baby twist, an urgent reminder of the life bound to her own. She pressed her lips together, and in her silence, the sound of her heartbeat filled her ears. The first rider barked, "This is your last chance. Step out or we come in." His rifle lifted, steady, aimed at the shadows where she hid. The second rider held the torch in his hand now, the cloth already dark with oil. The third kept silent, watching, calculating. The warrior's fingers closed around an arrow. He moved with the patience of stone, every muscle controlled. She could see the breath leave his chest slow, measured, as though he carried the weight of generations behind him. His eyes flicked once to her, steady and sure, and in them she read the unspoken. "Trust me." She wanted to believe, but the canyon was closing in. The riders pressing forward, the threat of fire licking at the edge of the air. Her voice trembled. Inside her, his name heavy on her tongue, waiting. One word could bind her fate. One silence could leave her to chance. The second rider struck flint, the spark flashing in the half-light. The torch caught flame, small but alive, and its glow painted their faces cruel and eager. The first rider grinned, lifting his rifle higher. The third narrowed his eyes at the shadows where they hid Dot, and in that instant, the world seemed to hold its breath. The warrior raised his bow. She clutched her belly. The riders pressed closer, firelight crawling along the canyon walls. The moment of collision hung suspended, sharp and endless, with every path balanced on the edge of what would happen next. Torch flared bright in the canyon, its light shivering across the stone walls and cutting into the shadows where they hid. For one breath, everything froze. The riders' laughter echoed, rough and certain, while the fire's glow danced on their faces. The warrior's bowstring tightened, silent and steady, his whole body poised like the moment before thunder breaks. She felt her own voice tremble. Against her lips, the name she had carried silently pressed so hard against her tongue it hurt. The baby shifted inside her, a sharp reminder that she could no longer stay voiceless. She whispered it. His name, a single sound, soft but clear, carried on the canyon air. It was enough. The warrior's eyes flicked to her for only a heartbeat, but in that heartbeat, something unspoken passed between them. His bow loosed. The arrow flew swift and sure, splitting the fire's glow. The torch dropped, tumbling to the ground, sparks scattering harmlessly across the dirt before they died. The riders shouted, startled, their easy confidence breaking like glass. The canyon exploded with movement. Horses reared, hooves striking stone. The first rider raised his rifle, but the warrior's second arrow snapped the weapon from his grasp, splintering wood and steel. The third tried to wheel his horse around for cover, but the narrow walls betrayed him, leaving no room to escape. Shouts bounced back and forth, confused, panicked, their earlier laughter swallowed by fear. She stayed pressed against the wall, hands trembling, her breath caught between prayer and disbelief. She had spoken his name, and the world itself seemed to bend around the weight of that choice. The warrior moved with a quiet fury, not reckless but precise. He did not chase the riders, only stood his ground, his bow steady, his gaze sharp, forcing them to see that this canyon would not yield them an easy prize. The second rider cursed, fumbling with his reins. "Not worth it," he spat, glaring into the shadows. "She ain't worth the fight." His words cut, but his fear betrayed him. The first snarled, his pride bruised, but even he saw the balance had shifted. The warrior was no longer just a shadow to them, he was a wall they could not pass. The third said nothing, only turned his horse with a sharp tug, his silence carrying more defeat than words. One by one, they backed away, their horses snorting and stamping, unwilling to press forward. The canyon seemed to exhale as the riders withdrew, their figures shrinking into the distance until the sound of hooves faded into nothing. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with what had nearly been. She sank to the ground, her legs weak, tears slipping unbidden down her cheeks. The warrior lowered his bow, his chest rising and falling slowly, his calm returning as though he had never left it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint sigh of the desert wind returning to its old rhythm. Finally, he turned to her. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "You spoke my name." She nodded, unable to form words. He crouched before her, his expression steady, unreadable but not cold. "It means you are under it now. My people will know. You are not alone." The truth of his words broke something open inside her, something she had kept buried beneath shame and fear. She had not realized how heavy loneliness had been until it began to lift. They rested there until the sun slid higher, the canyon lightening with each passing moment. She drank from his water pouch, ate a little more of the dried meat, her body trembling less with each bite. He said little, only watched the horizon, but she felt his presence as a constant shield. When they finally began to walk again, the land felt different. She was no longer a stray, nameless wanderer. She had taken shelter beneath something greater than herself, and though she did not yet know what that meant fully, she felt the ground steadier beneath her feet. The path wound upward into higher country, where the air was cooler and the juniper trees offered shade. By late afternoon they reached a ridge that opened onto a wide valley below. Smoke curled from small fires scattered across the plain, thin and controlled. The warrior stopped, his gaze sweeping over the sight. "My people," he said simply. His tone carried both pride and caution. Her heart leapt and sank at once. Pride because she had been carried this far. Caution because she did not know how she would be received. She touched her belly, whispering to the child within, "We are almost somewhere." He led her down slowly, carefully. They did not enter the camp at once. Instead, he guided her to a stream at the valley's edge, where she washed her face, drank deeply, and felt some of the desert's dust wash from her skin. He spoke to a younger man who had come to meet them, words exchanged quickly in a tongue she did not yet understand. She saw the younger man's eyes flick to her, then to her belly, then back to the warrior, before he nodded and rode ahead toward the camp. When evening came, the camp welcomed them, though cautiously. Eyes followed her, curious, measuring, but no hand was raised against her. A mat was laid for her near the fire, food offered, water given. She sat, overwhelmed, while the warrior spoke quietly with elders at the circle's edge. She could not hear the words, but she felt their weight. When he returned, he sat near her, and though his expression was calm as always, she sensed something had shifted. "They accept," he said softly. "You are under my name now until the child is born. After, we will see what paths open." His eyes held hers, steady and sure. "You will not walk alone again, not unless you choose it." Tears stung her eyes once more, but this time they were not born of fear. She looked at him, at the man who had stood like a wall between her and danger, at the name that now sheltered her. She whispered, "Thank you." It was not enough, but it was all she had. Days turned into weeks. A camp became a place where she was no longer a shadow. Women showed her how to weave mats, how to gather herbs for teas that eased the aches of her body. Children watched her with wide eyes, curious about the baby that grew inside her. The warrior came and went with the patrols, but always returned, always carried some new sign that he had kept danger at bay. When the time came, the women of the camp gathered around her, guiding her through the storm of pain and breath. The warrior did not enter, but she knew he waited just beyond, silent, steady, a presence she could lean on without even seeing him. At last her cries gave way to the pea. Cries of her child, a sound so fierce and alive it filled the night. She held the baby close, tears streaming, her heart breaking open with love and relief. When dawn came, the warrior stepped inside. His eyes softened as they fell on the child. She looked up at him, exhausted but certain, and whispered, "He has a name now." The warrior nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "He has a name, and he has a place." In the days that followed, the child became not only hers but theirs, cradled in the arms of women, guarded by the laughter of children, watched over by the men who rode with the warrior. She had found more than shelter, she had found belonging, and though she knew the world beyond the valley still carried dangers, she no longer feared them the way she once had. She carried the memory of the canyon, of the moment when she spoke his name and stepped through the doorway it opened. She carried the truth that even in the harshest desert, there could be protection, trust, and something like love. As she walked with her child in her arms, the Apache warrior at her side, she understood the lesson her journey had carved into. Her being alone had not been the end of her story. It had been the beginning. And now, with the strength of his name and the promise of her child's future, she was no longer just surviving. She was living, and the desert, once a place of emptiness and fear, had become the land where she found her home.